Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about how to control the distance of your point of view, so how to write a closer point of view or a more distant point of view, and specifically we're going to be looking at a term called psychic distance. This is the concept that basically explains how close a point of view is, and hopefully it will give you a bit of a deeper understanding on how to control point of view. We hear a lot about like a close point of view or distant point of view, but it can be a little unclear what that means or how to actually implement it in your work. So let's chat about it today. So psychic distance is how close the narrator is to the main character, and by extension, how close the reader will probably feel to the main character. As a reader, we might describe this as a point of view feeling close or intimate as opposed to distant. Now, a point of view that is too distant might make it hard to connect with the main character, whereas a point of view that is too close might make it hard to convey information. The closest possible point of view would be a stream of consciousness, while the farthest possible point of view would be an objective third-person narrator. The closer the point of view gets, the more subjective it is, and the further the point of view gets, the more objective it is. Here are a few things that you should know about psychic distance. It's definitely not the simplest concept in writing. It can be a little complicated, but here are a few things to keep in mind before we get into a bit of a deeper discussion of what it looks like. First of all is that it might not remain consistent throughout an entire piece. Although pieces will generally have like a general level of consistency, a certain piece might have a closer psychic distance or a farther psychic distance. Not every single paragraph or every single sentence is going to be at that exact same point. By nature, a more subjective line is going to be closer than a line that is more objective. So you don't want there to be drastic shifts in psychic distance or ones that don't make sense with what you've set up. Especially in third person, it's pretty natural to have some subtle shifts in psychic distance. Second of all is that the general rule is that the furthest you can ever go is where you begin. So if you begin with a really distant point of view, then your point of view can shift to be more distant at later points. But if you start really, really close, you can't really go more distant. This is because it doesn't really make sense for your narrator to lose knowledge about your character. So if you start with a really close psychic distance with a character but then shift to a really distant one later on, it's jarring and it's a little illogical. It doesn't really make sense with how narrators work. I know this is a little bit confusing, but I think it'll make sense when we look at an example in just a moment. And the final thing to keep in mind is that closer is not always better. The objective isn't to write the closest point of view all the time. Although typically readers like closer point of views, you're definitely going to find books that are a little more distant, and that is totally okay. There are many, many cases where you might want a more distant point of view and the story might benefit from that. Keep in mind the closest point of view is essentially a pure stream of consciousness, and I think it's pretty clear that we don't want that all the time in every story. There is of course kind of a general middle range that most stories fall under, kind of just like your average psychic distance that most stories will be at, where it's relatively close. You know, it's close enough that we can connect with the character, but not so close that it's hard to read. What's most important with psychic distance is really just that the psychic distance is where you want it to be. So if you want your point of view to be close, it's close. If you want it to be more distant, it's more distant. What you don't want is to be trying to write a close point of view and then inadvertently writing a really distant point of view. It's very common a mistake for new writers, especially new writers who are writing in third person, to accidentally make the point of view too distant, and then it kind of feels a bit sterile and detached. And even if you're writing in first person, you can make kind of those same little errors that can be a little jarring. So as a way to visualize this, because I know it's a lot to wrap your mind around, imagine you have two circles. One is the narrator and one is the main character. This is a really far psychic distance because they don't even overlap. So the narrator and the main character are a completely different entity. In the closest possible point of view, your narrator and your character overlap almost completely. So it looks like there's basically just one circle. There might be like a tiny, tiny sliver of distance, but it would basically be imperceptible to a reader. And then of course, in most cases, there's an overlap between the narrator and the main character. In a more distant point of view, it might be just a bit of overlap. In a close point of view, they might be very overlapped, but that's kind of a visual representation of the relationship between character and narrator. And you can, you know, increase or close that gap depending on how close you want the psychic distance to be. I'm going to read an example, and basically I'm going to read a paragraph and every sentence gets closer. It is 2021 and a woman is walking down the street. Joan is walking to the grocery store. She needs to buy milk. She's thinking of trying almond milk. I wonder how that will work in baking, she thinks. Probably disgusting. I don't even like almonds. What are you thinking? So let's look at this sentence by sentence and break down why certain sentences are closer versus further. So the first sentence we had was, it is 2021 and a woman is walking down the street. These are just objective facts. It is 2021. She is walking down the street. We don't need to really be in her mind to know these things about her. You know, like a lot of these you'll see like a job, like it is 2021 and the mailman is walking down the street. That is really distant. You can look out the window and see a mailman walking down the street. You're completely external. You don't have any access to his thoughts. So it's very distant. The second one, Joan is walking to the grocery store. So this is knowledge that dips a little bit into her mind because we know where she's going. We get her name, which is a more intimate way of referring to her. Referring to someone as something like the woman or the mailman or a title, you know, a characteristic is usually a more distant way of referring to a character. A name is a more intimate way of referring to a character. We know she's walking to the store, which is internal knowledge that she has about where she's going. If I look out the window and I see someone walking down the street, I have no idea where they're going. They know where they're going though. So that is some internal thought. Next up, we had the sentence, she needs to buy milk. She's thinking of trying almond milk. So we have a thought here. She's thinking of trying almond milk. So it's subtle, but it's starting to get closer. So the next sentence, I wonder how that will work in baking, she thinks. It is still distanced by the fact that we say she thinks. This reminds us that narrator and character are separate. Then we get the line, probably disgusting, I don't even like almonds. So this is an opinion. It's in her unique language. This is a thought that she's just having on her own. There's no external influence by narrator. And then finally, we get the line, what are you thinking? So this is very internal. So it is debatable whether second person is closer than first person, and I cannot provide an answer to that debate. I think it depends on the case. But in this specific case, she's talking to herself in second person, and that's pretty intimate. That is like an internal thought directed at herself. So in this case, I think that that's about as close as we can be. Let's switch the order of the sentences around and I'll show you why you can't really go backwards. So in this case, we started really distant and we got closer. What happens if we start closer and then end up going distant? So here's the exact same paragraph reordered. Joan is walking to the grocery store. She needs to buy milk. She's thinking of trying almond milk. I wonder how that will work in baking, she wonders. Probably disgusting. I don't even like almonds. What are you thinking? It is 2021 and a woman is walking down the street. It's very strange that the narrator calls her Joan and is internal to her thoughts, and then after being internal to her thoughts, suddenly sees her from an external point of view in a really objective way. It's really jarring and it doesn't really make sense. Zooming in makes sense, zooming out in such a jarring way doesn't really make sense. There are subtle cases where the point of view might get a little bit more distant. So for example, the sentence, probably disgusting, I don't even like almonds, is closer than the sentence, she needs to buy milk, she's thinking of trying almond milk. But even though we've had that sentence, probably disgusting, I don't even like almonds, the story would still be able to shift back out to the same point as she needs to buy milk, she's thinking of trying almond milk. Because it's not so jarring, the story can make that shift. But the shift from what are you thinking to it is 2021 and a woman is walking down the street is too drastic and too jarring. It doesn't really make sense with the narrator and what they know. The narrator knows her name is Joan and has had internal access to her thought, so why is it now seeing her from an external viewpoint? That said, we've looked at an example. What are things that distance the point of view? What are things that bring it closer? First of all is how you refer to your character. I mentioned that earlier, but the way you refer to your character can distance the point of view. A more intimate form of referring to your character, like their name or just a pronoun, is more intimate than an external label because people don't really think of themselves that way. A lot of the time you'll see in books with more distant point of views characters referred to as like the tall man, but we don't really think of ourselves that way, or they'll be referred to by their job title, the dentist, but again, we don't really think of ourselves that way. So that's a more distant way to see a character because it's how an outsider would observe them. So obviously it makes sense if you're describing a side character, but if you describe your narrator that way, it's a very distant way of seeing them. A more intimate way of seeing them is just with their name. Second of all is how objective the statement is. So obviously there will be cases that your narrator will state more objective things and cases they'll state more subjective things, because some things are just more objective. You know, if the character is perceiving the weather, you know, it's raining. Like right now I look outside, it's raining. It's raining. That's pretty much an objective fact that it's raining. So it's objective to say it's raining, but it's subjective to say it's raining and this is my favorite kind of weather. Third is the language that you use. So the closer a point of view is, the more accurate the language used has to be to the character's own diction. Talked about this in our video on voice, which I'll leave a link to. So that's why in first person, let's say you have a first person character who is a 7-year-old boy and he is narrating the story in present tense. So he's narrating it as a 7-year-old boy. It would not make sense for him to be using, you know, really complicated long words that make him sound like a grad student. That just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with his knowledge or his background or what he knows. If the story was being told from a distant third person, you might be able to get away with that language because there's more separation between narrator and character. So the narrator here isn't him. In a close first person, he is the narrator. So we have to use language appropriate to the character. So the language you use and how aligned it is with language the character would use does change the point of view. And finally is how thought is conveyed. So obviously in first person, all thought is just narrative, but in third person, there are multiple ways to convey thoughts. I showed you guys in that example, we had that sentence, I wonder how it will work in baking, she thinks. Saying she thinks actually distances the point of view. It's a filter. Filters are a form of telling that distance the point of view. We talked about them before. They can be something like she hears, she sees, she thinks, she wonders, she believes. Anything that tells us this is the character's experience. In a closer point of view, we don't have that. For example, she hears a woodpecker pecking the tree outside. Whereas in a closer point of view, it would just be a woodpecker pecks the tree outside. It's closer because we don't need to be told the main character is experiencing it, because the narrator and the character are more seamlessly blended. So there are a lot of different ways to convey thoughts. It actually is more distant to put a thought in first person and tell us that the character is thinking it than it is to just integrate the thought. So actually that example I gave you, I wonder how that will work in baking, she thinks. The more psychically close way to phrase that sentence, and I know this is very complicated, but I'd recommend to start looking for this in the things you read and you'll be able to learn a lot about psychic distance that way. A closer way to say that would be, how will that work in baking? Basically, anytime that you remind us that the narrator and the character are different, then you distance the point of view. And in that case, saying she thinks distances the point of view. Because is she thinking she thinks? Like, do you think I thought after everything you think? No, you don't. You just think the thing. So that's not something she's actually thinking. The she thinks isn't something she's thinking. So in that case, it distances the point of view. Same thing if you see something. Do you see something and then go, oh, I just saw that? You just see the thing, you just perceive it. That's why it's more distant to tell us that it was seen than to just show us the image. Most of this simply comes down to how much influence does the narrator have on the story. This is why third person usually has the capability to go more distant than first person, because in first person, the narrator is the character, so it can never really go outside the main character's brain, right? Like, we're locked in to that. Whereas in third person, we have the ability to control distance. Basically, we can zoom much further out. It doesn't mean that third person is inherently more distant, because a third person narrative can feel just as close as a first person narrative. If you implement the things that I was just talking about on how to make a point of view closer, you can write really close, intimate feeling third person points of view. But a third person narrator just has more ability to control distance. First person narrators can never really be objective. They're people, they're first person narrators. They are basically incapable of looking objectively at the story. So a lot of the time we talk about, you know, third person being more distant than first person, but that's not really necessarily the case. It's more the case of psychic distance. So specific point of views like first person, second person, or third person can vary in psychic distance. They don't just have one set psychic distance. So that is an introduction to psychic distance and how to write a close or more distant point of view, how to control your point of view more. It's definitely a bit of a mind-boggling topic. It definitely took me a bit to get the hang of. I don't think I really understood it when I first learned about it. But what my recommendation would be is to just start looking for this in things you read. When you notice that it's a bit more distant, ask yourself why and really dissect that. If you notice it's really close, try to kind of dissect that and ask yourself why it feels really close. That really is the best way to familiarize yourself with any writing craft topic, is to analyze it in what you're reading, especially when it's something like this, which does take a bit of practice to learn how to use. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye.